Let's talk a little bit about sectional density. What is sectional density? Basically, it allows you to determine the penetration characteristics of a projectile. Now, take for an example, over here on the left we have a piece of plywood, and we're looking at it end on here, so it looks kind of thin, but it's a sheet of plywood. Over here on the right, we have a wooden dowel rod. It's a 1/2 inch in diameter, weighs 1/4 pound. Now, if I were to hurl that wooden dowel rod at the plywood like a spear, it would hit the plywood and stop dead and drop to the ground. But now let's assume I have a piece of steel rebar. Same 1/2 inch diameter, but the steel rebar weighs 7 pounds. Now, if I were to hurl that at the plywood, it has enough weight behind it to blast through that plywood and penetrate it. As a third example, let's say we have an aluminum cylinder. Now, the aluminum cylinder is 5 inches in diameter, and since it's made of aluminum, it still only weighs 7 pounds, the same as the rebar. Now, if I were to take that aluminum cylinder somehow and throw it like a spear, it would hit the plywood and stop dead, just like the wooden dowel rod. It might leave a dent, but won't penetrate. Now, we can calculate the sectional density or the penetration characteristics of a projectile with the following formula. Weight in pounds divided by the diameter squared. So let's take the case of our wooden dowel. Our wooden dowel is 1/4 pound, so it's 0.25, and it's a 1/2 inch in diameter. So at the bottom of the formula I have 0.5 inches times 0.5 inches. And that comes out to 0.25 divided by 0.25. So the sectional density of our wooden dowel is 1. Now, let's apply that same formula to our steel rebar. Steel rebar is 7 pounds. It's also a 1/2 inch in diameter, so we have the 0.5 inch times 0.5 inch on the bottom there. And that comes out to 7 divided by 0.25. And that gives us a sectional density of 28, much higher than the wooden dowel rod. And again, let's apply that same formula to our aluminum cylinder. The aluminum cylinder is also 7 pounds, but the diameter is 5 inches. So we have 5 inches times 5 inches on the bottom. That comes out to 7 divided by 25. So our aluminum cylinder has a sectional density of 0.28, very low, even smaller than our wooden dowel rod. Now, I don't think any of us needed a mathematical formula to determine that the steel rebar had the best shot of penetrating through that piece of plywood. Here we have our 3 projectiles here. The steel rebar with a very high sectional density of 28, while our wooden dowel has a sectional density of 1, and the SD for aluminum cylinder is 0.28. So, as you can see, the higher the sectional density of a projectile, the better the penetration characteristics of that projectile. Now, as I mentioned, we don't need a mathematical formula to determine that the steel rebar would go through that plywood and the wooden dowel would not. But now, let's think about it in terms of bullets. Well, bullets are tiny little objects, and relatively tiny compared to our aluminum cylinder and steel rebar. They're less than 1/2 inch in diameter. The difference in weight from bullet to bullet is just a few thousandths of a pound. So you can't really look at a bullet and determine, gee, will that penetrate the plywood or a particular material or not. So what we have to do is calculate the sectional density for bullets. Now we have to modify our formula a little bit. That uppercase W there at the top, that represents the weight in pounds. Well, we measure bullets in grains, not in pounds. The bottom, the capital D there, is the diameter in inches, and that's fine because we also measure our bullets in inches, or the diameter of our bullets in inches. So we have to modify this formula a little bit. And the first thing we need to do, it's simple enough to convert the weight in pounds to grains. Since there's exactly 7,000 grains in a pound, we simply multiply the weight times 7,000. Now, I freely admit that I slept through most of high school algebra class, but the one thing I did retain from Mrs. Yunkin is that anything I do at the top of the formula, I also have to do to the bottom of the formula. So we have to multiply our diameter squared by 7,000 as well. And we can simplify that by changing the formula to look like this. Here I have a lowercase w that represents the weight in grains instead of pounds. And on the bottom then, the formula becomes 7,000 times the diameter in inches squared. Now, let's apply that to a couple of popular bullet sizes. At the top here, we have a 223 Remington bullet. It's 55 grains, 0.224 inches in diameter. And using our formula there, we find that the sectional density for this particular bullet is 0.157. Now on the bottom here, we have a 150 grain 308 bullet. And it has a sectional density of 0.226 once we apply this formula. Now I don't think that's surprising to anybody that a 150 grain 308 bullet is going to have better penetration capabilities than a 55 grain 223. But let's take a look at a couple of handgun bullets here. Here we have at the top, we have a 180 grain 40 caliber bullet. And it has a sectional density of 0.161 once we apply our formula here. Now on the bottom we have a 230 grain 45 caliber bullet. Now you would expect that, bigger bullet, heavier, to have better penetration capabilities. But its sectional density is only 0.162. And what this should illustrate to you is that the larger the diameter of a projectile, the more weight it has to have behind it in order to achieve the same penetration capabilities or the same sectional density as a smaller, lighter bullet. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why the 40 cal Smith & Wesson was so popular, was so touted when it first came out, that we can have the same penetration capabilities while at the same time reducing recoil. We can fit more rounds in a magazine, etc., than we can with the 45. So this is one of the reasons why the 40 caliber Smith & Wesson was so popular, and the 10 millimeter as well. We achieve the same penetration with a lighter, smaller bullet. Now, what does all this mean in terms of bullet selection? And why did I just spend the last 5 minutes of your life with a math lesson? Well, for us target shooters, sectional density doesn't really come into play in terms of penetration capabilities. For example, an air gun shooting a BB will go through paper. A BB is 177 thousandths of an inch in diameter and weighs about 5.4 grains. It has a sectional density of 0.022, very small, but it'll still go through paper. So for us target shooters, sectional density isn't as important, although it does come into play a little bit in my next segment here on ballistic coefficients. But for the hunter, sectional density is an important aspect in selecting a bullet. Now, they need to decide what kind of bullet to use for a particular application. For example, a bullet with a sectional density of around 180, a little higher, a little lower, is good for varmint hunting, squirrel and gopher, that sort of thing. For small game like deer, goats, and yes, people, sectional density of 230 or thereabouts is better. When you get up to 280 sectional density, then we're talking about medium game like elk, antelope, or even moose. And when we get up over 300, well, now we're talking about large game like bear or even elephant. So a hunter, if he's going out for a particular type of game, he's going to select a cartridge or reload bullets that have the appropriate sectional density for the kind of game that he's going after. So that's generally how hunters use sectional density. Target shooters, not so much. Now, don't confuse sectional density with stopping power. Sectional density can determine the penetration characteristics of a bullet, but in terms of stopping power, you were talking about uh, getting into the bullet's shape and the bullet composition. For example, with varmint hunting, you would want a bullet that expands very rapidly because you don't want the bullet to go all the way through the animal without expanding at all. So you want something that's going to hit and start expanding right away. Whereas with, say, medium game, elk or antelope, you want the bullet to penetrate the skin, the fur, the muscle and bone, uh, and hold together before it really starts expanding. So the wound channel through the vital organs is larger. But if it breaks apart as soon as it hits the fur, the skin of the animal, it may not, the penetration, you may not get the kind of penetration you need in order to get a clean kill. And you don't want to wound the animal. That's just cruel. And hunters are very conscientious about getting a clean kill without uh, the animal suffering, so to speak. Um, Now, in the small game group there, where I've included people, uh, 230 sectional density is a little high, but here we're talking, I think, more about military or police applications where you're dealing with people who are wearing heavy combat gear. You got backpacks and heavy mesh straps holding their gear on, and combat armor and things like that. So for a defensive round, a sectional density of 0.230 is a little high. But for military and police applications, I think that's more appropriate, maybe even bigger if you're dealing with combat armor. Now here's a list of bullets in my Reloaders Workshop program. Now this is by no means a complete database. The database, for example, for handguns that I have here only includes 9mm 40 cal and 45 caliber bullets. So there are smaller bullets, larger bullets, heavier bullets, lighter bullets, and so on. This is by no means a complete list. Now I've sorted the bullets in order of sectional density. That's what the ST column here is, from lowest to highest. Now, you see here in the database that I'm using, my handgun bullets range anywhere from a sectional density of 0.130 to 0.179. Now, you may be wondering, in the previous segment we talked about 230 sectional or 0.230 sectional density is the small game uh, range, which included people. Well, this is actually a good thing that the sectional density of handgun bullets is fairly low because you're typically using a handgun in a defensive posture, either in the home or in public, where overpenetration can be a problem. You don't want a bullet that's going to be going through your assailant and through the wall and into the home or apartment next door. You also don't want it going through your assailant and taking out your 72-inch flat screen. So the fact that handgun bullets have such a low sectional density is actually a good thing. It'll penetrate the person, and depending on the expansion properties of the bullet you're using, it'll either kill him or wound him. I hate to be callous about it, but that's kind of where it is. So at any rate, the 9mm to 45 caliber bullets that I have in my database range anywhere from 130 to 179 sectional density. Now let's take a look at the rifle bullets. And at the very low end here, I've got a 204 caliber 24 grain bullet that's way down at 0.082 sectional density. And if we go up to the top sectional density here, here's a 308 caliber 225 grain bullet, with a sectional density of 0.339. So that would be good for large game. And then we have everything in between. So you have a wide range of choices depending on the use that you're going to be putting that bullet to. Now, one thing I did want to point out here, here's the 55 grain 223 caliber bullet that we looked at earlier with a sectional density of 0.157. Now, that low sectional density tells us a couple of things. One, a lot of people assume that an AR-15, for example, is not a good rifle to use for home defense. They think because it's a rifle that bullet's going to go through your assailant, through the walls, through your TV, and through everything else. But in reality, the 223 Remington with a 55 grain bullet has a fairly low sectional density, which means a fairly low penetration capability. So the AR-15 is actually a good defensive weapon to use in your home. Now, on the downside, the military, when they first came out with the M16, they were having some penetration troubles with their lightweight 55 grain 5.56 ammunition. I understand now the 5.56 NATO rounds are a little heavier now and have better penetration. But you know, if you're in the military, you can confirm or deny that particular claim. I haven't been in the military for 30 years, so I'm not sure where they're at these days. Any rate, so you can see that there's a wide range of sectional densities to choose from, and depending on your application in a hunting world, you can make a decision on which bullet to use based on the sectional density of the particular bullet. Now, as you've seen, the sectional density of a bullet is all about the weight and frontal area or diameter of the bullet. Doesn't take into consideration the shape of the bullet. Well, the ballistic coefficient is all about shape. As soon as the bullet leaves the muzzle of your rifle, it's affected by several environmental factors. For example, drag or air resistance. As soon as it leaves the muzzle, it's going to encounter the air in the atmosphere. And depending on how much drag that bullet has, the faster it's going to lose velocity due to air resistance. It's also going to be affected by gravity. It's going to be pulled down toward the ground. And the slower the bullet is moving, or the faster it loses its velocity, the more effect gravity is going to have on that bullet. It's also affected by wind. Wind is going to cause that bullet to veer off course. Now, most people think of wind as being on the horizontal plane. In other words, it moves it left and right. But wind can also go up and down on the vertical plane. For instance, if you're in a mountainous area, the wind may be moving up or down depending on whether you're on the windward or leeward side of a peak, that sort of thing. Now, ballistic coefficient is dimensionless. It's not measured in inches or grains or foot-pounds or anything like that. It's simply a value. There's no dimension to it. The values range anywhere from 0 to 1 or even higher. Some bullets out there do have a ballistic coefficient of higher than 1, although you won't see any that have a ballistic coefficient of 0. I mean, a rock has a ballistic coefficient higher than 0. So the bigger the number, the better. The higher your ballistic coefficient, the less drag that bullet has. And that value is calculated by the manufacturer, and it requires some specialized equipment, ranging anywhere from multiple chronographs to Doppler radar and that sort of thing. Now, just a note about the calculations or the ballistic coefficients that are provided by the manufacturer. Each manufacturer calculates their ballistic coefficient a little differently. I mean, there's some universal constants that they all use, but they're calculated slightly differently. So it's kind of hard to compare bullet A from manufacturer ABC with bullet B from manufacturer XYZ, because those two manufacturers may have calculated that ballistic coefficient differently. So you can use it as a comparison to a degree, but it's a better comparison among bullets from the same manufacturer than it is from bullets from different manufacturers. And also, if you've ever gone shopping for a flat screen TV, for example, one of the specifications you look at when you're looking for a flat screen is the contrast ratio. And you look at television A, and it has a contrast ratio of 1 to 10,000. And you look at television B from a different manufacturer, and it has a contrast ratio of 1 to 10 million. Well, does that mean that television B is 1,000 times better than television A? No. They're calculated a little differently, and some manufacturers will do a calculation that exaggerates their contrast ratio of their televisions a little bit so that their TV looks better. Well, bullet manufacturers do the same thing. They tend to exaggerate their ballistic coefficients a little bit. So if you create a trajectory or a bullet drop chart, for example, and the bullet drop chart says at 300 yards the bullet will drop 20 inches based on the ballistic coefficient and the muzzle velocity and so on. But you get out to the range and it actually drops 30 inches. Well, that could be your bullet drop calculation was done wrong, but it's also very likely that the manufacturer exaggerated their ballistic coefficient a little bit. So that's kind of common, and that's, some manufacturers do it more so than others because they know that when reloaders are out there shopping for bullets, they're looking at that ballistic coefficient and determining which bullet to buy, so they want their bullet to look better. Now, mathematically, the ballistic coefficient is the ratio of a bullet's sectional density to its coefficient of form. Now, what's coefficient of form? Well, that's just fancy talk for shape. So if you're talking to someone who raises his pinky while he sips his tea and reminisces about the good old days at Harvard, you can call it coefficient of form. When you're at the range talking to normal folk, you can call it shape. We'll know what you're talking about. Now, the shape affects the ballistic coefficient quite a bit. For example, a Spitzer or pointy bullet will have a higher ballistic coefficient than a round point. A round point bullet will have a higher ballistic coefficient than a flat point bullet. Okay. Now, a higher ballistic coefficient means a few things. The bullet will have a flatter trajectory because it maintains its velocity better. As it travels, it'll be less affected by gravity because it has a higher velocity over a given range. It'll also arrive at the target faster since there's less air resistance, less drag, and it maintains its velocity better. It'll arrive at the target a little quicker, and that can be important to hunters. For example, if they're shooting at a moving target, they don't want to, they give the target less lead time, that sort of thing. And a higher ballistic coefficient means that the bullet will be less affected by wind. Now, let's take a look at a couple of examples. Take a look at it. Here's the Hornady 30-35 interlock round nose bullet. Now, this is a 308 bullet, 150 grain. It has a ballistic coefficient of 0.186. Now, the Hornady 30-31 interlock spire point bullet is identical. It has the same weight, the same body shape and form, but it has a spire point nose or head. And it has a ballistic coefficient of 0.338, quite a bit higher. Now here's the Hornady 30-33 interlock boat tails fire point. It's identical in every way to the 3031, with the exception that this is a boat tail bullet. And that boat tail will reduce the drag of the bullet, the friction of the air. There's less surface of the body of the bullet to produce friction with the air. And it has a ballistic coefficient of 0.349, a little bit higher. Okay, so as you can see, the shape of the nose or the head of the bullet has a much higher effect on the ballistic coefficient of a bullet than the boat tail. The boat tail gives it a little bit better, but not quite as much as the nose of the bullet. Now let's take a look at some other bullets here. For instance, some 308 caliber 165 grain bullets. Now Hornady doesn't make an interlock round nose bullet at 165 grains, but they do make a 165 grain interlock spire point. It's identical in every way to the 3031 bullet, with the exception that it's 165 grains. And that bullet has a ballistic coefficient of 0.387, quite a bit higher even than the 3033 with the boat tail. They also make the 3045 interlock boat tail spire point bullet. This is identical in every way to the 3033 bullet, with the exception, of course, that it's 165 grains. And you can see it has a ballistic coefficient of 0.435. So in addition to the nose, the shape of the nose of a bullet being a major factor in the ballistic coefficient calculation, the weight of the bullet also has a major effect on the ballistic coefficient. The bullets on the left here have a sectional density of 0.226, while the bullets on the right have a sectional density of 0.248. So given two identical bullets, the bullet with the superior sectional density will have a higher ballistic coefficient. It'll maintain its velocity better. It'll have a flatter trajectory. It'll be less affected by wind, that sort of thing. So given the two bullets, 150 grain versus 165 grain, if you're looking for a flatter trajectory, you would go with the heavier bullet. Now that's assuming that, based on the twist rate of your rifle and the sectional density being correct for the application you're going to put that bullet to. Those are other factors that would affect your choice in bullets, but these would be the factors. Given all things equal, the bullet with the higher ballistic coefficient may be the way to go. Now, don't confuse a higher ballistic coefficient with a bullet being better than one with a lower ballistic coefficient. For example, the two bullets on the bottom there, the Hornady 3033 and the 3045. Even though the 3033 bullet has a lower ballistic coefficient, you can load that bullet to a higher velocity than you can with the 3035 or the 3045. So given that, you may achieve a better trajectory or a flatter trajectory with the 3033, even though it has a lower ballistic coefficient, because you're shooting it at a higher muzzle velocity. So to really compare the two bullets, you can't just look at the ballistic coefficient. You really have to create a ballistics table and look at the drop chart to see what the trajectory of the two bullets are and compare them that way, rather than just going by the ballistic coefficient alone. So it takes a little more research. You can assume that the bullet with the higher ballistic coefficient, the higher ballistic coefficient, has superior drag characteristics and that sort of thing, and will be less affected by wind. But assuming you're shooting them both at the same muzzle velocity, so you really kind of have to look at other things. You can't just look at the ballistic coefficient by itself. That's all for this video. I hope you liked it. If so, please click the like button. Maybe even subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and happy reloading.